And we're back. Feed the Dragon podcast, Feed the Dragon show. Ryan Ray alongside a good friend, Chris Fenton. Chris, we missed last week. We'll talk about a minute, without power for a few days, and you were on a good, nice scheduled vacation. But the news said, you know what, we're going to press on without without it. So we got a lot of catching up to do.
It literally feels like dog years since we last did an episode. I mean, I think we're maybe 8 days out or something like that. So multiply it by 7. I think that's like 56 days worth of news when you're talking about China. So I'm super excited to be back. I have no idea how we're going to fit it all into the 35 minutes of crispness that we try to do. So we might have to do about 50 episodes in the next day to cover it all. But I'm super excited. It was actually, if you're going to time a blackout in Texas and you're going to time a trip to the mountains with your family, you might as well do it during the Chinese New Year, because instead of missing 56 days of news out of China, instead of missing 56, we probably would have missed 306 if it was actually a normal period of the year. So I think the timing sort of worked considering. So let's dig into it.
Yeah, and just let's talk about the Texas thing real quick. So there's a piece from the Sun, the-sun.com, talking about China mocking Texas for the power outage. And you, I think, had texted me this last week. Hey, get ready for this story. And it's interesting because China's free to put out whatever they want to put out. I'm not mad about that. But you would think, Chris, that the U.S. papers would understand that. Okay, if you want to report on this story, fine. This is what China's saying. But also, you should balance it out with China refuses to buy coal from Australia. There's ships in the port. They have blackouts because they just want to be jerks about it. So whatever you want to say about the Texas problem, and I've covered that extensively at the War Room newsletter, Texas Long Gas podcast. So folks who want to go follow what happened in Texas, we've got plenty of coverage on that. But it's not the same as what happens in China when they have blackouts, when they have people freezing to death because they just refuse to buy from countries. And it's a little disappointing to see that some U.S. media companies don't balance that out.
Well, look, I mean, it's something that we battle on this show, and that I'm battling and you're battling when it comes to trying to solve the problem of Chinese encroachment on the United States of America and what we value as Americans, because it involves tackling that challenge as both red and blue. It involves a complete bipartisan effort, or even whatever other parties there are out there to tackle this challenge. And when you look at things like Texas having a blackout, I mean, let's face it, it's a red state. It's stolen or taken a lot of citizens from various states that are in the blue, including California. And I think there was a bit of schadenfreude by mainstream media over this story. And I think that overshadowed more important aspects of the story, including sort of the ridicule that we were getting out of China when, quite frankly, if you dig a little deeper on the China front, you realize they're way worse than what we had happening in Texas. I do have to say, I mean, your friend, Senator Ted Cruz, and somebody that I've been following because of his work on the China front. I sort of wish the Cancun story didn't get pulled in there, because I need him focused on China and need him focused on those big directives that I fully support when it comes to the other superpowers. So to have interest deviated from that topic and that initiative because he went on a vacation that he probably shouldn't have gone on. Anyway, I could have done without that story, put it that way.
Yeah, and hey, real quick, I'm going to put you out, let you hop back in. We're getting a little bit of feedback there, and I'll kind of follow up to what you said and let you reboot there. I don't know if it's coming through just on my end or what's going on. But so while we're talking about that, I think the issue when you talk about power stuff as far as it pertains to the U.S. is that we have different grids. They're all set differently. There's a lot of things that go into this problem. Into what Chris is pointing out there is that you look at that and you say, well, okay, we have problems, and this is the narrative when you look at the communist narrative versus the capitalist narrative. No system is perfect. They're all going to have flaws, and so to blindly say that, well, capitalism without flaws, well, that's silly. But then to parrot the narrative that communism, because they can focus everyone in one direction, they're without faults rather. Sorry, and so it's a little bit disappointing, a little bit frustrating, especially from the U.S. Paper. Now, a paper like the Global Times, which had a story this morning, I guess it was, you expect propaganda with no pushback from them, and that's what we got when they are graciously bringing back the NBA. They say, obviously, we take credit on this podcast for being the ones leading that charge, but they're bringing it back for the All-Star weekend. Any significance why that time period, Chris? Any thoughts on why they may have picked the All-Star period to bring back the NBA to China?
Well, first of all, I thought it was unbelievably a humble brag type of tweet that they sent out earlier today about allowing the NBA back on CCTV broadcast networks starting March 8th. In it, they fully announced the fact that there has only been one game on CCTV since the infamous Daryl Morey tweet of October 2019. They also purposely put at Daryl Morey, Daryl, I think it's or D Morey, his actual Twitter feed handle, so that he could see this thing on his own feed. It was a true rub it in moment for the Global Times, just to remind him that he had, screwed up the NBA's business in China for that long, which, by the way, kudos for Daryl Morey sticking up for the Hong Kong protesters and putting that tweet out there. And kudos to the Philadelphia 76ers for having the guts or the balls to hire Daryl Morey back into the NBA, because the guy is really good at what he does, and I believe in what he believes in. So thank you, Sixers. Now, the NBA have their games coming back on the 8th. I think the Global Times, which is the mouthpiece of the Chinese Communist Party, obviously, so it's really the Chinese Communist Party making that announcement, have made it clear, hey, NBA, you play by our rules or you don't have access to our market. And I really think now is the time that we stop putting up with this crap. And what I'm loving too is, aside from the NBA story, we have this brewing Beijing Olympic 2022 story coming up. We just saw Reps Mike Waltz, who I worked with on the China Task Force, and also Rep John Cato, who both came out saying that we should impose a boycott of our athletes going to participate in the Beijing Olympics. I think this is a major, major pressure point for the CCP. Like I said, that 2008 Olympics was their coming out party. It was adolescence into adulthood. Now they're in adulthood, and this 2022 Olympics is essentially their fancy dinner party, and they want everybody in attendance.
So I'm curious. We are starting to see that pressure mount a little bit. The last time I threw out this theory that maybe the CCP is going to, they either have to stop doing what they're doing, or they will lose the Olympics, or they're prepared to lose the Olympics. You said, hey, it kind of caught you off guard. You're thinking about it. Have you put any more thought to that on how we should gauge what the CCP does? Because they cannot continue down this track, and yet they seem to be doing that.
I literally think the hubris of the CCP is, and we've done everything possible to make them have this hubris, is that if they impose various potential punishments for countries that don't attend, for companies that boycott, for different partners, for different athletes that don't decide to come, those punishments are something that are real, that are scary, that are serious threats that all these potential boycotters are going to take heed of. And ultimately, the CCP will win. They will prevail, and people will not boycott this upcoming Olympics, and governments will not boycott, and companies won't boycott. That is the calculus that the CCP is making, and we have done everything possible over the last 40 years to make them feel like that's the smart calculus. Now the question is whether we can turn the tide. Can we actually flip it so that the leverage is on our side? Can we actually start to talk about possibly boycotting and bring in other allies to potentially boycott also, and carry that threat to a point where we will follow through if they don't do certain things? And then what are those things? What are those baby steps that we want addressed prior to February of next year in order to attend those games? I really think there is a tremendous opportunity right now to do this and to get it done with leverage and actually fix some things in a very short amount of time, less than a year.
So I just realized this about the news. We didn't talk about Joe Biden's comments, and Joe Biden got a lot of flack for what he said about Xi Jinping and the CCP last week. And I'll be honest with you, I think I've watched the last 4 years, the liberals criticize Trump for every not properly nuanced word that he says. And I felt the same thing about Biden. If you listen to what Biden said, I thought he nailed Xi Jinping's agenda, the CCP's agenda. He called them xenophobic. No one talks about that. Like, he called them xenophobic publicly for the world to hear. And the cultural norm things, I think I know what he was getting at, and I think people took it out of context. But the fact that the sitting U.S. president, new administration, called the CCP xenophobes, I thought was a big win for folks who want to kind of push back on some of the CCP narrative. If you're a private company, if you're an athlete, and you want to say, you know what, we want to be critical of China, I thought Biden actually gave you an opportunity to do that. And he also said that they expect it. They expect the president to do that. So we now have the ability to push him for that as well.
Well, if I look at sort of what's happening right now with Biden coming in, with the Jake Sullivans, with the Eli Ratners, with the Allison Rosenbergers, et cetera, that are coming in around him as far as advisors on the China topic, we're starting to see a hawkishness that seems to be taking where the Trump administration was and moving it into another level. We're also seeing the mainstream media, part of, essentially the system that we get our news from, starting to take real notice of this issue and starting to talk about it. I mean, even Jake Tapper on CNN has started to really criticize our policies and company policies toward the Xinjiang province and the Uyghur issue, right? Like, we have not seen that on CNN very much up until now. And I can say from my own experience, CBS this morning ran a segment on Hollywood's the China encroachment on Hollywood's business, and the way they have censored our free speech rights and our creativity for the last 20, 30 years. And it has been gaining steam and amplifying. CBS ran a tremendously strong segment on Saturday that I was a part of, and I was super honored to be involved on that segment with AI Weiwei, who's arguably the most famous dissident out there. He talked about 2 documentaries that he did on both Hong Kong and the Wuhan beginning of the COVID crisis that have not found distribution in Hollywood because of some of these issues that the big conglomerates have in offending the CCP. Also, Isaac Stonefish from Washington Post was on there, and so was Stanley Rosen from the USC, who's one of the best soft power analysts out there. It was really great. And to see CBS carry that, and all the great buzz that's come from it, and some of the national spots that I'll be doing this week because of it, is fantastic. And then on top of it, I'm lecturing tomorrow all morning, starting at 5:55 in the morning at the United States Naval Academy about this very subject too. So the main point of this is that people are talking about the issue of the U.S.-China dynamic and how it is completely tilted towards the China side. We have not been in this place before. We've been in the place where various people have been pulling the fire alarm, for instance, Donald Trump, but we haven't seen a large amount of momentum, a large block of the populace starting to talk about it and platforms allowing that speak. But now it's happening. I feel like we're changing it little by little. And Feeding the Dragon podcast, you and me, Ryan, we're doing it, man.
Well, it's interesting because we'll move on to this, but there was a lot of concern about when Biden came in, he'd be soft on China, and we will see ultimately where the policies lie. But to your point about CNN criticizing Trump, listen, I guess criticizing China, there's no doubt that CNN, isn't prone to agree with Trump unless they had to. So now that Trump's gone and Biden is kind of cracking down, it gives the media who didn't want to agree with Trump the ability to go after things that they didn't historically want to go after. Of course, we'll see how the right responds. I was a little bit disappointed, as I said. I thought the conservative media overplayed the cultural norms comment. The Biden administration has called it a genocide since August of last year, at least. So I thought that was kind of overplayed. But I think that's, on this China issue, from my perspective, is we always want to try to be fair, because that's what China does not want. They want to publish the Global Times piece about Daryl Morey. They want to talk about the power outages in Texas. They don't want to be fair. And so if we're going to comment on the issue, we have to be fair. Doesn't mean we'll always be right, but we have to be at least fair and intellectually honest. And so hopefully this podcast and other shows will play into that. I'll let you respond and we'll move on.
Yeah, well, I mean, and part of that fairness is also being fair to the other side of the Pacific. I mean, I have many friends that are mainland Chinese. I like the Chinese people. I actually sort of want to go back there sometime again in the near future. I'm a fan of the country, a fan of the people, a fan of the culture. I think where the issue is with the government there and the way the government behaves and the way the government behaves externally, most importantly. I mean, I could almost say that, you know what, we would like to impose change on how they deal with internal affairs. And I'm not talking about Taiwan or Hong Kong or some of these other things they consider internal, but inside the borders of the actual mainland PRC, you could argue, hey, you know what? Let them do what they want to do. It's their country. Their people seem to be okay with it, whatever it is, right? The big issue is what they do externally and how it affects us here in the United States of America, how it affects our Western allies, how it affects people all over the world. That is the issue. And that is what the government's doing. It's not what the people are doing. It's what the government is imposing. They are encroaching outside of their borders. And that's something we need to stop.
Okay, so we kind of started on the Olympics. I got a sidetrack. Let's get back to the Olympics. We are starting to see that momentum build. Really, I think from the Olympic standpoint, as we've talked about, there's two real things. The athletes, I'm not to be rude here, but the athletes are almost irrelevant. It's the corporate sponsors and it's the politicians. So the politicians, you're starting to see, hey, maybe we should boycott. We should look at this. If the corporate sponsors get behind it, then we will see some real traction. I'm not sure there's enough political capital to really push the corporate sponsors in that direction. I'm not saying that we should either, but I think we have to have the corporate sponsors before we're really going to see a movement to relocate the Olympics. Because listen, the corporate sponsors, they're there to make money. They want to run ads. They want to make money. And so you talked about where we would be in the ad process. Is it too late to get the corporate sponsors to consider a relocation? Do you think they have too many dollars tied up in this process in China already?
Well, it's like everything when it comes to somewhat decoupling or disentangling with China. I mean, there's so much money on the line and such a long lead of money and entanglement that's been built up that it's very expensive and quite punishing to a lot of these companies to actually pull somewhat out of China. We're not asking for a full decoupling, obviously. We're talking about one particular upcoming Olympics, right, in 2022, where a certain statement can be made on a very global stage and something that has very high visibility, which means it could have a lot of leverage in getting change to occur. If you look at all these companies, yes, they do have time to move back a lot of their spend. They have time to actually backtrack some of the expectations of what they were going to initiate in that market during that time. So there really is a moment to do this. And what's interesting is that this, once again, cannot be one company doing it. It has to be sort of led by someone. And if it's not led by the government, it's got to be led by individuals in these industries saying, let's band together, let's boycott, or at least threaten to boycott until we get certain changes done. If we all unite, and in fact, Isaac Stonefish in that CBS interview on Saturday did talk about the fact that if every studio got together and said no, that would actually create the leverage to have the CCP retreat. We have never done that with anything that we've done in the modern era. We have not used the unification of this country, the unification of companies, the unification of athletes, the unification of industries to impose change, to create the leverage necessary to do it. And now is the time. And once again, no sacrificial lamb, lone wolf process is going to get it done. It's got to be a united front.
Well, and the other thing is that, you talk about United Front. It wouldn't take too many athletes coming out saying that when we go to China, we're going to talk about this for China to have to make a decision. So if the U.S. men's basketball team or whatever started coming out and said, when we go to China, we're talking about the Uyghurs. If they start saying that now, China would then have to decide, do they want the Olympics? Because not only with the U.S., you have the other national, because the NBA obviously is a multinational league. So you start seeing that going through the different teams. China would then have to decide what they're going to do and how they're going to handle the Olympics. So there's a way to put a unique pressure that allows China to have the Olympics, but say, you know what, we're going to say what we want when we get there. And we have the runway to start putting that messaging out today if we want to as well.
Yeah, but I don't know. I mean, the problem of saying what we want when they get there is just about saying stuff that will hopefully enact baby step change after the Olympics are over. I actually think the real opportunity to sort of crack down on some of this encroachment is right now. I mean, I'm not saying we're going to be able to fix the Xinjiang province concentration camps before February 2022, but we might be able to impose initiatives that have some sort of long-term strategy that does end that. But at the very least, we have baby step approaches that we can take, which are, hey, we want athletes, we want companies, we want industries to speak out against what's happening in the Xinjiang province and with those camps for the Uyghurs. We want them to be able to speak out about Tibet. We want them to speak out about Hong Kong. We want them to speak out about Taiwan. We want them to speak about other human rights issues, et cetera, and do so without retaliation from the China market. And if you do retaliate in any sort of way, China, we are not coming to your dinner party.
Well, yeah, I don't think they'd be invited. That's what I'm saying. So if they came out, if the NBA Olympic team came out today and said, you know what, when we go to China, we're talking about the Uyghur issue or whatever issue you want to talk about, and they started saying that, well, reporters in the U.S. would ask, and so you'd have this momentum being built up until when they were there. I don't think the CCP would allow that. I think they would have to decide, do they want the risk? Because you're going to have to risk censoring the games in China. It's supposed to be a big spectacle, all these events. I think that's how you put the pressure on them, is by talking about it now. As you're saying, but announcing that you're going to do it, then you've kind of put them on notice. Hey, when you get here, we're going to talk about these things, which means for 300 and whatever it is days, 65 days, we will be talking about this. And the CCP, if they're afraid of a tweet from Daryl Morey, the last thing they want to do is turn on the NBA All-Star Weekend and have the fear of some NBA players talking about it on a halftime interview or post-game interview. So I think that's kind of the I think we're saying the same thing, just a little bit differently there.
Well, then, and where my question is, who leads that charge? Do you say, I mean, I know you're a libertarian, so like, are you saying that the government essentially says, okay, here are the playing rules for everybody in regards to China moving forward, and we will protect you as the United States of America if there's any sort of retaliation against you in China?
Yeah. So if it were me, and if I could get, I think the NBA is where it would start at. And what if I was a grand strategist here, I would sit down and I would say, okay, let's get a peripheral athlete that's going to the Beijing Olympics and have them say something. So Bob the bobsledder, he's going to say something. Then the coordination would be is to use a LeBron James. I don't know who's on the Olympic team for the men's basketball, but use them to then look at what they say and then prop it up. So you kind of get the peripheral actor over here to say something, and then you get an NBA player to back and support them, because they might want to silence the lone wolf, to your point. But then all of a sudden the NBA players said, well, once the NBA players start talking about it, that's a brotherhood of Americans, of Italians, of Spanish, French, wherever. And so then you could kind of have this global thing happen quite rapidly, because they're going to defend each other. And if you've looked at the NBA, Ernest Cantor, and how he's been very critical of the Turkish government. The other NBA players, they might not understand all the issues in Turkey, but they do seem to kind of support what he says. So maybe get the peripheral guy to kind of take the first step, and then use the bigger names to back that person as the guys of, we're all Olympians here representing our country. And then you bring the NBA into it. They have a multinational aspect, and then it can spread to the other national Olympic teams. So that would be my thought.
Well, what's interesting too is that the Beijing Olympics 2022 are the winter sports, which obviously aren't normally as high.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
They're not as high profile, right? But if you start it with the NBA and some of the more high profile global sports, including soccer and so on, and possibly use the canvas or the stage of the Tokyo Olympics, which I don't know are going to happen or not, but if they do, and then you use those podiums to really sort of rub it into China more and more, and then that really puts the emphasis on the winter athletes to continue that throughout the rest of the year, and then going into the actual Olympics themselves, that could be a really interesting play. I do wonder though, and we've talked about this before, it really has to feel unified, and it also has to feel like athletes are not completely selling out their future, right? Because remember, a lot of these athletes are not Michael Phelps or, LeBron James and filthy rich. They live off of the subsidies of the Olympic Committee here in the United States and all the different programs. They do not have a lot of money, and their real opportunities to win a medal at these Olympics and actually parlay that into some sort of fruitful career. So if they feel like they're the only ones doing it and no partners, corporate partners, various other teams, leagues, et cetera, are going to support them in taking a stand, I don't blame them for staying quiet. So we really, once again, have to have everybody united on this idea. And before anybody can say, hey, you know what, you're never going to get that done. It's just too complicated. It's hard to rally everybody together. I would argue, once again, for that domestic issue over the summer of the BLM and the violence of police on Black Americans and so on, like the leagues, it started with the NBA and other leagues, other athletes, other partners, all rallied around that cause together. There was true solidarity built among lots of different entities, a real unified front over a cause. And we saw that work. And I could say that on an international level, we can do the same exact thing. We've seen it happen domestically. There is no reason we can't do it internationally.
Yeah, I'm glad you clarified. I was thinking of the wrong Olympics. So this year is the basketball. So next year you would have hockey, something like that. So to your point, I think we agree here. The coordination would be as you have the athlete who has everything to risk going out saying something, knowing that the cavalry's behind him. So once the pressure begins to mount, then you have the bigger names that are ready to step in and support him. And listen, stuff like this happens all the time. As far as if it's coordinated, it's just a matter of whether or not people want to do it. Olympics, we talked about the Global Times. I know there was something else that you mentioned in the pre-show that you wanted to get. I don't have it in my notes here. What was it? You're muted. You're muted.
We talked about Daryl Morey. We talked about how that tweet essentially was heard around the world. What he was tweeting about was the rights of the Hong Kong protesters and their fight for not necessarily a true democracy, but something that was similar to what they grew up with under British rule and something that was supposed to last another 27 years at least. Now we're seeing the fallout of a lot of that crackdown in some of the trials that are occurring in Hong Kong right now. We're also seeing Xi Jinping really make a lot of different announcements about what Hong Kong's going to be in the future, the way they're going to look at dissidents, the way they expect that court system to work. We're starting to see the ramifications of it in their relationship with the UK. I think it's really interesting and both really quick watching how massively fast and massively large this transformation is of what was a very, very separate entity from the PRC.
Yeah. Well, it feels like the China news is going a mile a minute. And one of the things that I was looking at this morning and it kind of got me a little bit concerned is that there was a report from the China Africa podcast or newsletter. I don't know if you get that or not, but it's about the amount of vaccines that China is giving or going to give or give at a cheap price to Africa to help kind of solidify that base. And the author was kind of frustrated that the U.S. isn't doing its part to give to Africa. And that's a story to follow over the next 6 to 12 months. Is that the CCP, for all the things we critical of them they're very shrewd. They understand how to play this game quite well, and they know how to pull the right levers, push the right buttons. It's not as we look at the Tom Cruise's Top Gun jacket being changed, like, oh my goodness gracious. Well, it's a lot more complicated of a system than that. And sometimes if we're not careful, we kind of dull it down and just pretend like these are a bunch of dolces over there. No, they're very sharp actors or players, if you want to call them that.
Yeah, and by the way, you bring up a good point. Well, first of all, what the Africa Belt and Road Initiative, the debt trap that they put them under, all of that, I mean, that's a whole episode in itself and really interesting to talk about. One little nugget that you brought up there too, which is, the flight jacket and Top Gun and how we have to be careful what we, show in movies, but then also Africa has to sort of dampen the way they talk about China, all that kind of stuff. Like, what's interesting is that after that hit I had on Saturday on CBS and various other things that I've done recently, people ask, well, is it really that big a deal that they're asking you to do this or that with a movie? As long as a movie does well and all that stuff, like, who cares? Well, I think what Hollywood is a real symbol. It's like a symbolism of what's going on, right? Like, and yes, you can change the flag on the back of the jacket and hope no one sees it. But when they do see it, it does look really bad. But is it really that bad? Well, I will say, yes, it is, because it's symbolic of what's happening in all industries with all nations in the way that China's trying to govern their narrative around the world. It's that wolf warrior diplomacy. It's the ability to push outwardly their objectives and to silence any critics. And I think Hollywood's just a nice, high profile, very tangible thing to see that type of censorship, that type of propaganda happen. And what people need to do is extrapolate that away from the movies, away from the content, and apply it to just the way speech is stifled everywhere in this world right now with anybody that has any sort of conflict or any sort of interest inside the China market.
Yeah, and I would parse it like this. I would say that when you look at the top, it's a matter of knowledge, right? So you don't know what you don't know, and so if you go and you watch the Tom Cruise movie, and I haven't seen Top Gun in years, so I would have never noticed the jacket change, right? I would have no idea. So there's a couple questions. One, in the movie, do they explain why they changed the jacket? Is there like a throwaway line? Well, it's a new jacket or something like that. So that would be the first thing. Two, if it's not, the jacket's changed, does the consumer understand why it's changed? Because that's really the issue at hand here, is that these things have been going on behind closed doors and people don't understand this is what's happening, what's going on here. Once it's kind of being exposed for the general consumer, then they can kind of weigh in and give their 2 cents on it. So obviously, if the NBA wanted to go play basketball in China and they said, we want you to play on a red court, and like, okay, whatever, and we're gonna pay you $100 billion. Well, no one's gonna necessarily get mad at that. If they say, well, we're gonna pay you $100 billion to play on a red court, but oh, by the way, you can't say these 15 things as well. It's like, oh, okay, so the red court's kind of secondary. The money is to get your speech. So the consumer being able to understand why these things are being changed, I think is the best thing about that piece. And what we're seeing now is that people have known that things were happening, but they couldn't really put their finger on it. So now it's kind of coming out, and they can kind of digest it, ask questions, put pressure. And these companies, as resilient as they have been with the China stuff, they do buckle under pressure quite easily. And so the more pieces like you guys did on Saturday, the easier it is, I think, to get public sentiment to put pressure on them.
Yeah, and they buckle under pressure immediately, right? Like, and we even saw it with Tesla and Elon Musk recently. I mean, it was only a matter of moments before apologies were issued for the last, ruckus that occurred between Tesla and the CCP. This kind of stuff has no room for error, and the against them in that market is going to be super detrimental to the share price and to the investors that are investing in these companies. So, CCP knows it. They have the hubris. We go right back to what we were talking about earlier in the program, which was the hubris of the CCP feeling like they have every ability to say, hey, if you don't come to these Olympics, you're going to have to deal with some severe punishments. And that goes across the board for any country, any athlete, any industry, any company. We have shown time and time again that we relent to that we will put up with the fact that they control and have the leverage over us, mainly because we're all working as lone wolves and we're all just trying to survive as individuals. But united, we stand.
Okay, that is it for today's show. If you missed any of this, you can check out the podcast anywhere good podcasts are found. Chris, good luck with your presentation tomorrow it's at the Naval Academy, right?
Yeah, I'll be at U.S. Naval Academy, and then I'll be on WGN News Nation tomorrow night, national broadcast, I think at 6:35 p.m. PT. And then also I did send out a trailer. If anybody is listening to this or watching this in France, on France 2, there will be a really interesting documentary called China, the Grand Offensive. I watched the trailer. I understood my part because I was speaking in English, didn't understand what everybody else was saying there. So I'm looking forward to the English link to it. But I am really excited to check it out because it looks super intense. Michael Stansky, he really did an amazing job, at least with some of the footage I've seen. So hopefully it resonates and hopefully it spreads around the world a bit, this really strong message that it seems is starting to pick up steam and people are talking about more and more.
Okay. Sorry. All right, everyone. We will be back again. Let's see. Today's Tuesday, probably Thursday, maybe Thursday or Friday with a show, and do another one, at least one, maybe two more this week. And hope everyone stays safe out there. And talk to you.
And by the way, I'm going to add, Ryan, if you need any power or heat or whatever, you're always welcome out here in California. We have a really good system. So we pay lots of taxes to get it to work.
You know what? I can't say anything. I just got to eat that one. Okay. Talk to everyone later.
Hey, thanks, everybody.